It was supposed to be an ordinary night. Dr. Malaki Okoro had just returned home after a long day at the hospital, where he spent his hours saving lives and mentoring young residents who looked up to him. His home, a modest but well-kept lake cabin, had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the constant demands of his career and enjoy a rare moment of peace. He loved the quiet hum of the crickets outside, the gentle sway of the trees, and the stillness of the lake that seemed to mirror the sky. Inside his cabin, shelves of books lined the walls, photographs of family adorned the mantel, and the faint smell of coffee lingered from the pot he had brewed earlier. To anyone else, it was just a house. To Malachi, it was proof of years of hard work, sacrifice, and resilience. He had built a life grounded in service, integrity, and quiet dignity. For him, this night was supposed to be no different, another evening of rest before returning to the hospital in the morning. What he didn't know was that this night, and this house he called home, would soon become the stage for a confrontation that would expose not only the fragile nature of peace, but also the brutal persistence of racism in places where it should never belong. The air outside was calm, but tension was already gathering just beyond the edges of his quiet world. It started with small disturbances, sounds that didn't belong in the rhythm of his neighborhood. At first, Malachi brushed it off, a car door slamming, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. But then came the knock, sharp and demanding, rattling the wooden frame of his front door. Malachi hesitated, his hand resting on the knob. On the other side stood three men, faces hardened with entitlement, their HOA badges pinned like shields of authority they did not truly hold. "We need to come inside," one of them said, his tone carrying more command than request. Confused, Malachi replied, "For what reason?" But his words barely mattered. They pushed past the threshold, their boots loud against the hardwood floor. It was as if his home no longer belonged to him, as if his very presence there required explanation. Malachi felt a knot in his stomach tighten. He was a respected doctor, a man who had poured his life into helping others, yet in this moment, none of that shielded him. His degrees on the wall, his photos of family, his years of sacrifice, none of it mattered. To them, he was not a neighbor, not a man, just a black body in a space they thought he shouldn't own. As they moved through his living room, opening doors and peering into corners, Malachi's pulse quickened. "You have no right to be here," he said firmly, but his voice betrayed the edge of unease building inside him. One of the men smirked, replying, "We have every right. We're the HOA. We protect this neighborhood." Protect. The word stung. Who exactly did they think they were protecting? Malachi's heart pounded harder as the men grew bolder, their questions sharper, their stares heavier. "Do you even live here?" one asked, ignoring the framed family photo beside him. The absurdity burned, but so did the danger. Malachi had seen too many stories end in tragedy, too many lives shattered, because a man in his position had spoken too loudly, moved too quickly, resisted too firmly. He stood frozen, caught between dignity and survival. And just when it seemed the walls themselves were closing in, another sound pierced the night, the front door opening again. The air shifted as Governor Evelyn Grant stepped inside, her presence commanding, her voice carrying authority the intruders could not ignore. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her gaze sweeping the room. The men stuttered, their arrogance faltering, but the damage was already done. Malachi stood there, humiliated, stripped of his humanity in the place he called home. His face was calm, but inside he was shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer exhaustion of being reduced once again to something less than a man. In that moment, surrounded by trespassers in his own house, Malachi realized this wasn't just about him anymore. Phones had been pulled out, neighbors had gathered, and eyes across the nation would soon see the truth. The climax had arrived. The question now was not whether Malachi would endure, he always had, but whether the world would finally reckon with what it had witnessed. The house fell silent after the storm had passed. But the silence wasn't peace. It was heavy, unsettling, filled with questions that had no easy answers. Dr. Malaki Okoro stood in the middle of his living room, the same space where moments earlier he had been treated like a criminal in his own home. The HOA members had scattered, their arrogance shattered by the sudden presence of Governor Evelyn Grant. What began as a night of intrusion ended in a public unmasking of prejudice, one that could no longer be swept under the rug. But even as the governor's voice cut through the chaos, condemning their actions, Malachi's heart still carried the sting of humiliation. For no matter how high he had climbed, no matter how many lives he had healed, his skin color had once again been seen as a... The days that followed brought more than whispers. They brought headlines. Clips recorded by neighbors spread across the internet, shared millions of times. The image of Malachi standing in his own home, surrounded by men who claimed authority where none existed, became a symbol. To some, it was just another story, another incident in a sea of injustices. But to many, it was undeniable proof of the quiet, persistent violence of racism, the kind that doesn't come with sirens or guns, but with suspicion, trespassing, and the audacity to question a man's right to belong where he lived. The governor's presence had saved Malachi from what could have spiraled further, but it also raised deeper questions. Why did it take the weight of her office to make those men step back? Why were his profession, his years of service, and his very humanity not enough to halt their cruelty? Malachi knew this wasn't just about him. It was about every black man and woman who had been forced to defend their existence in spaces they rightfully called their own. His story was no longer his alone. It belonged to a larger, painful truth that stretched across communities and generations. Yet, amidst the outrage, something else began to grow. Young men and women reached out to Malachi, inspired by his composure in the face of disrespect. Churches and community groups rallied around him, demanding accountability from the HOA and sparking conversations about the everyday forms of racism that often go unpunished. Even strangers who had never met him felt connected to his struggle, their voices joining a chorus that refused to let this incident fade into silence. The weight of the moment was not just in the injustice. It was in the possibility of change that followed. But Malachi himself remained reflective. As he sat at his desk late into the night, the glow of his lamp casting long shadows on the walls, he thought of the patients he had treated, the families he had comforted, and the years of sacrifice and study that brought him here. He thought of how quickly all of it had been stripped away in the eyes of men who saw only his skin. And he realized something undeniable. Dignity could never be handed to him by institutions, nor stolen by ignorance. It lived in how he carried himself, in his refusal to bow to hatred. Still, he knew one truth that burned deeper than all others. He had survived this, but countless others had not. His story had reached millions, but so many stories never made it past the front porch, never saw the light of justice, never earned the presence of a governor to intervene. For every Malachi Okoro whose name was spoken, there were hundreds more whose names were lost. And that is why his story matters, not because it is unique, but because it is not. It is part of a pattern, a mirror reflecting the flaws of a nation still wrestling with promises of equality it has yet to fulfill. Malachi Okoro returned to his life, but not unchanged. He walked through his neighborhood with the same quiet strength, yet now his steps carried a heavier weight, a reminder that even in success, his skin remained a target. And yet he chose not to hide. His story was not one of defeat, but of resilience, of a man who stood firm in the face of humiliation and turned it into a call for justice. So, as you hear this story, ask yourself, how many more Malachis will it take? How many more doors must be broken down? How many more lives must be disrespected before the world finally learns to see not color, but humanity? If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, if you believe silence is no longer an option, then let your voice join the chorus. Watch, share, comment, and subscribe, because change begins when we refuse to look away.